shadows stretched across the valley like silent witnesses. A town once alive now whispers only to the wind. Wooden streets rotted under the weight of forgotten footsteps. Doors hung crooked, creaking in the emptiness. Smoke no longer curls from chimneys, yet faint smells of fires linger. Those who once lived here vanished, leaving the town to decay and silenced. In the mid-1800s, a small town emerged quietly in a secluded valley of the United States. The valley was shielded by steep hills, dense forests, and a river that cut through the landscape, providing both life and hidden danger. Settlers arrived with wagons packed full of supplies, tools, and livestock. They sought fertile land, clean water, and the promise of a stable life far from crowded cities. Timber houses went up quickly along a narrow main street. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the faint clatter of hammers echoed in the crisp air. Families built their lives around routines of work and community. Farmers cultivated the rich soil, while a local blacksmith forged the tools that kept daily life moving. Children played along the riverbanks, laughing as they skipped stones and splashed in the shallow water. Merchants opened small shops, displaying goods brought from distant towns. A modest schoolhouse occupied the town center, where children learned reading, writing, and arithmetic under the watchful eyes of a single teacher. Evenings were marked by the warm glow of lanterns in windows and the quiet smoke of home fires drifting skyward. Despite the apparent calm, the valley held its own risks. Winters were harsh, with snow burying fields and collapsing roofs. Spring floods often transformed the river into a destructive force, washing away crops and toppling fences. The forests surrounding the town teemed with wildlife, including predators that could threaten livestock or even humans. Inhabitants learned quickly to respect these dangers, and the town developed an unspoken rhythm dictated by nature. At first, the town thrived. Letters carried news of railroads and cities far beyond the valley, and travelers occasionally brought stories of distant places. The community grew cautiously, building and repairing structures as needed. Life was modest but predictable. However, the valley's very isolation would later prove to be its undoing. Supplies were not always reliable, and help from neighboring towns could take days or weeks to arrive. The settlers' hope for permanence was strong. Fields were abundant, wells ran deep, and forests provided timber for building. Yet, beneath this promise of stability, the valley's quiet landscape concealed fragility. Small missteps, unforeseen events, or harsh seasons could unravel months of careful planning. Unseen forces, storms, floods, and disease, waited patiently, invisible yet inevitable. The town's story was only beginning, and the seeds of its eventual disappearance were quietly taking root. By the early 1860s, the valley town's quiet existence began to fracture. Spring brought heavy rains that turned the river into a swollen, threatening force. Wooden bridges shook under the rushing water. Fields that had once fed the town were now marshes of mud and debris. Farmers worked desperately to save what remained, but each day brought new damage. Fences were torn away, livestock drowned, and crops rotted in the waterlogged soil. Scarcity grew, and tension spread through the community. Families argued over the allocation of resources. The blacksmith, once the town's steadfast anchor, found his workshop damaged beyond repair. Tools were scarce, and repairs slowed to a crawl. Merchants hesitated to travel the dangerous roads, leaving shelves empty and hearts anxious. The children's laughter grew less frequent, replaced by hushed conversations about what might happen next. Disease soon followed disaster. The combination of flooding, stagnant water, and overcrowded homes created fertile ground for illness. Fevers and chills struck the young and old alike. Families buried their dead quietly, fearing contagion and the growing emptiness of their streets. Some townsfolk began leaving, carrying only what they could, trudging up hills and down narrow trails into the surrounding wilderness. Others refused to abandon their homes, clinging stubbornly to the life they had built. Rumors of misfortune traveled faster than the settlers themselves. Travelers spoke of families vanishing overnight. Some claimed to hear the wailing of children near the riverbanks. Others whispered about strange shadows among the trees. Fear settled over the town like a fog, seeping into every home and hallway. Even the strongest-hearted settlers began to doubt that the valley could sustain life. By mid-decade, the valley's decline was undeniable. Homes once filled with laughter now stood empty, doors swinging in the wind. The schoolhouse, once a hub of learning, was shuttered as children disappeared with their families. Fields lay untended, forests creeping in to reclaim the land. Only a few stubborn souls remained, tirelessly repairing roofs, clearing debris, and rationing meager supplies. They worked long hours, but each night the valley grew darker and quieter. As the years progressed, nature intensified its grip. Spring floods came earlier and stronger. Winter storms buried homes under snow and ice. Livestock perished one after another, leaving survivors with empty barns. Villagers debated one final time whether to leave or persevere. Some wanted to build barriers against the river, to repair every collapsed roof. Others argued that the valley itself had rejected them, and that survival lay beyond the hills. Tension fractured the few remaining families. Even in their persistence, the town's cohesion weakened. Houses were abandoned mid-repair. Wells ran dry or were contaminated. The river's unpredictable course threatened even the safest homes. Each disaster left the remaining settlers more isolated and desperate. Visitors, once a rare curiosity, stopped coming entirely. Stories of the valley town's troubles spread outward, but only as fragmented tales of loss and vanishing lives. By the end of this period, the town teetered on the edge. Its streets, once alive with merchants and children, had grown quiet. Smoke no longer rose from chimneys. Shadows filled empty homes. The valley's isolation, once a blessing, now became a trap. Nature waited patiently, and the town's slow descent into abandonment was all but inevitable. The winter of 1868 arrived with an intensity the valley had never known. Snow fell relentlessly for weeks, layering the town in a thick, suffocating white. Roofs sagged under the weight of ice, while frozen streams cut off the few paths connecting the settlement to the outside world. The river, once a gentle companion to the town's life, now churned with deadly force beneath ice sheets that threatened to collapse without warning. Every morning revealed new damage, every evening brought a deeper dread. Inside the homes, families struggled to survive. Firewood was scarce. Food dwindled to meager rations of dried beans, spoiled flour, and frozen vegetables dug from the earth. Children huddled under blankets while their parents worked tirelessly to keep stoves burning and walls insulated. Illness spread more rapidly than ever. Fever and frostbite took hold of those too weak to endure the bitter cold. The town's few remaining doctors were overwhelmed. Even with all their knowledge, they could not prevent the growing number of deaths. As the storm intensified, the river finally broke its banks. Torrential water swept through the valley in a roaring wall, tearing away what little remained. Barns collapsed, carrying the last of the livestock into the frozen current. Wooden bridges splintered and were swept downstream. Families who had survived previous hardships found themselves trapped in their own homes, with rising water creeping toward floorboards. Some tried to escape on foot, but the icy floodwaters swallowed roads and paths alike. Others clung to the hillsides, watching in horror as their homes disintegrated. Panic spread through the valley. Even the bravest settlers were paralyzed by the sheer force of nature. Shouts echoed across the frozen landscape, only to be swallowed by wind and snow. Men, women, and children scrambled to save possessions, but every effort was futile. Homes and shops that had stood for decades were reduced to piles of timber, mud, and debris within hours. By nightfall, a blanket of silence descended over the valley, pierced only by the occasional creak of collapsing structures. In the aftermath, only a few scattered survivors remained. They wandered the hills, carrying what they could on their backs, watching as the river reshaped the valley. The town, once full of life, was now a fragmented landscape of wreckage. Foundations were cracked, chimneys toppled, and fences lay strewn across muddy fields. Even the forest, previously held at bay, began creeping over what was left of the streets and homes. By the following spring, the valley was empty. No smoke rose from chimneys, no footsteps marked the streets. Nature claimed what remained, covering the town in a quiet, indifferent embrace. Trees bent over collapsed roofs, wild grasses filled empty streets, and the river's course had shifted, leaving scars across the land where homes once stood. The few survivors told fragmented stories of families lost to the flood, of houses swept away, of nights spent frozen and terrified. Those stories became whispers, fading with time, leaving the valley itself as the only witness to the town's final hours. The climax of the town's existence was violent, merciless, and swift. What had been a vibrant community vanished almost overnight. The structures that held the town together, the very symbols of human perseverance, were destroyed. Life itself seemed to evaporate under the weight of storm, ice, and river. In the valley, only silence remained, a silence that would endure for decades, leaving no one to remember except the land itself. Years passed. The valley remained silent. Where once children's laughter rang out, only the wind now whispered through broken trees. Foundations of timber houses rotted beneath moss. Chimneys leaned precariously or lay shattered in the mud. Streets, once crowded with life, were covered by wild grasses and fallen branches. No smoke rose from chimneys. No footsteps echoed on wooden planks. The town had ceased to exist, yet traces lingered like shadows of a vanished world. Travelers who happened upon the valley told strange tales. Some claimed to see flickers of movement through fog. Others swore they heard faint cries or the metallic clatter of a hammer from ruins long abandoned. Yet, when they approached, the valley revealed only decay. Empty homes stared blankly, windows shattered, doors ajar. Nature had reclaimed what humans had built. Trees grew through walls. Creepers twisted around fences. The river, once a lifeline and a destroyer, had shifted, leaving muddy scars and dry channels where homes had once stood. The few surviving families carried memories of the town into distant settlements. They spoke quietly of the floods, of nights frozen in terror, of barns swept away and livestock lost. But time dulled these recollections. Children of the next generation asked questions that had no answers. Maps no longer listed the town. Letters and journals survived only in fragments. Slowly, the stories faded. The valley became a ghost, remembered only in whispers. By the end of the century, no one remained. Nature had fully absorbed the settlement. Forests and vines covered the streets. Animals wandered freely among the ruins. The river's course had changed, erasing landmarks familiar to the settlers. Even the soil bore traces of human habitation only faintly, as if reluctant to remember the toil and life that had once filled the valley. Visitors often felt an eerie stillness, a quiet unlike anywhere else. The silence spoke of absence, of lives erased from memory. The town that had thrived in the 1800s was gone, yet the land remembered in subtle ways: the slope of hills, the curvature of the river, the indentations of old roads. All else was forgotten. Time had sealed the valley town in obscurity. No festivals, no markets, No school bells remained. Only the earth and the wind carried fragments of a vanished existence. In the end, the valley town survived only in the land itself. Its story exists in glimpses, letters half decayed, photographs blackened by age, and the rare voice of an elderly survivor recounting long-forgotten days. But the people, their routines, their hopes, and their struggles, have disappeared. Nothing remains but emptiness. Forgotten. Silent. Lost to history. The valley, once alive, now holds only shadows, and the wind continues to move through what is left, indifferent and eternal.